Walter Griggs drove himself 40 miles on gravel roads to the hospital with 2 fingers hanging off his hand by skin. The admitting nurse wrote, "drove himself in the chart notes. She wasn't sure she believed it. October 1972. The spruce and poplar country northeast of Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. Boreal woodland breaking into open prairie, trapline territory without a paved road for miles in any direction. Walter, 62, had retired from the railway the previous spring after 40 years on locomotives. His trapline covered close to 10 square miles. He had walked it so many times in the dark he knew it the way most men know their own kitchen. He carried a Ruger .22 LR on every run. It was for dispatching live animals in his sets. That was all it was for. 3 weeks earlier, he had found claw marks high on his chicken coop wall. He figured black bear. That was the reasonable assumption. Grizzlies hadn't been documented in that drainage in living memory. The morning of the 14th was foggy, visibility dropping to 20 feet by the time he was 2 hours into his run. He found his largest snare dragged 40 yards into a spruce thicket. The steel cable kinked beyond use, the anchor post pulled clean out of frozen ground. He followed the drag trail, expecting a wolf, maybe a large beaver. He found a juvenile grizzly, roughly 250 pounds, sitting on the hindquarters of a freshly killed deer, watching him. The pronounced shoulder hump and dished face left no room for misinterpretation. Walter had never encountered one in this country in his life. The bear's ears went flat against its skull. It didn't bluff. It didn't stand to posture. It locked eyes with him and stayed exactly where it was. Walter raised the .22 and fired a warning shot over the animal's head. He told the doctor later that he knew it was wrong before the bear even moved. That's in the hospital notes. The doctor found it notable enough to write down. The bear covered 30 feet in under 2 seconds. Walter dropped the rifle and grabbed the lowest limb of the nearest fir tree, hauling himself up just as the bear hit the trunk. The grizzly reared and snapped its jaws shut on Walter's trailing left hand, his weight going up, the bear's weight pulling down, and the ring and little fingers were crushed against the bark, joints shattered, flesh stripped. Walter kicked free and kept climbing. He stopped at 25 feet, where the trunk narrowed, and the branches were too thin to hold 250 pounds. The bear climbed 10 feet after him, the limbs bowing under its weight, then dropped back to the ground. Walter looked at his left hand. The 2 fingers were held on by skin. He wrapped his hand with his wool scarf, used his belt to strap himself to the trunk so he wouldn't fall if he lost consciousness. The bear dragged the deer carcass to the base of the tree and fed on it through the afternoon. The fog never lifted. By mid-afternoon, the temperature was 26 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping. The bear moved off before first light. Walter waited until mid-morning, unbuckled himself, climbed down, left the .22 where it had fallen, and walked back to his farmstead. Then he got in his truck. The walk back is not described in any account. Nobody asked him about it directly, and Walter never brought it up. Medical findings and aftermath. The surgeons couldn't salvage the fingers. Crush injury, shattered bone, tissue too damaged to repair. They amputated the ring and little fingers of the left hand at the proximal interphalangeal joint, debrided the wound to prevent gangrene, and kept Walter 4 days on intravenous antibiotics. He recovered full use of his remaining fingers within 3 months and returned to his trapline the following winter. Grip strength in the left hand was permanently reduced, which changed how he set heavy snare cables in the cold. He adapted. He trapped for another 15 years. He switched to a lever-action .45-70 government. When a reporter called after the wildlife office confirmed the grizzly identification, Walter said the caliber change wasn't a precaution. He said the .22 had created the problem, and the .45-70 was a correction. He thought it came out sounding more dramatic than he intended. Incident analysis.
Firing a light-caliber rimfire at a bear actively guarding a food source was the error. Not because it failed to wound. Walter fired over the animal deliberately. Because the sharp, concussive crack of a rimfire produced exactly the stimulus most likely to trigger a food aggression charge. The warning shot didn't deter the bear. It started the attack. Walter survived because he climbed high enough. At 15 feet, the juvenile grizzly could have reached him. At 25 feet, the branches couldn't hold the animal's weight. 10 feet of altitude was the difference. The improvised pressure dressing and belt anchor were correct calls, made under shock, in the dark, at 26 degrees Fahrenheit, alone. Most people don't execute that clearly after losing 2 fingers. Wildlife officials initially dismissed the grizzly report. The bite radius changed their position. Practical takeaway. A warning shot from a light caliber rifle is not a deterrent for a bear in food aggression mode. It is a stimulus. If you cannot stop the animal, you are better served by retreating silently than by producing a sharp sound at close range. And if you work remote country, any remote country, carry a rifle adequate for the heaviest predator that could plausibly be there. Not the heaviest predator you expect, the one you can't rule out.
Before we jump to the next story, if you're watching on TV, you can point your phone at the code in the corner to subscribe. That way, you won't miss the next incident report. The next case begins in a few seconds. Frank Halstead had hunted backcountry Alaska for 11 years before the night everything he thought he knew about stopping power got tested at 30 feet. Late September 2007, a remote watershed southeast of Glennallen, alder corridors, glacial creek beds, willow flats that pushed visibility down to 30 feet. Frank, 56, and his hunting partner Gary Trent, 51, were 4 days into a backcountry moose hunt. They had driven a logging spur 6 miles in, established base camp in a spruce clearing. Meat cache hung 100 yards downwind. Nothing about the setup suggested what was coming. Fourth morning, Gary crouched over tracks in a muddy creek bank. Hind print, 10 inches long, claw indentations punching 2.5 inches ahead of the toe pads. He put the boar at 700 pounds. Frank thought the mud was distorting the print. Gary didn't change his estimate. They talked about relocating camp. The alders were dense, the packs were heavy, the light was going. They decided to stay. That decision would cost Frank his arm. That evening, the wind died. The forest went completely quiet. Gary set down his spoon and didn't pick it up again. The bear came out of the brush without a sound. Stiff-legged, rolling gait, head low, eyes on the men rather than the food cache. Not curious, not surprised. It had come specifically to where they were. Frank brought his .308 up and fired 3 rounds in under 5 seconds. 2 hit the bear's right shoulder and brisket. Neither broke enough bone to drop it. The bear crossed 30 feet in under 2 seconds. It drove its full mass into Frank before he could cycle the bolt, throwing him backward over the stove. Frank threw his left arm up to protect his face. The bear swatted. The blunt force snapped his ulna, and the claws tore deep into the muscle of his forearm. Gary fired from 6 feet, once into the neck, once into the chest. The bear released Frank, spun, and crashed into the dark timber. They could hear it in the brush 50 yards out, breathing in long, ragged pulls. Frank was on his feet, left arm hanging useless, bleeding heavily. Gary pointed to a granite outcrop 20 feet behind camp. They climbed it. Frank went up one-armed, without being asked twice. 2 hours on the ledge, listening to the bear die. Temperature dropped to 29 degrees Fahrenheit. Gary tore strips from a dry base layer, packed them against the lacerations, and wrapped the forearm tightly. He splinted the fracture with a tent stake and cordage, arm elevated across Frank's chest. It controlled the bleeding and kept the bone from moving. At first light, the bear was dead in the alders. 650 pounds, which meant Frank had been right about the mud. Neither man has mentioned this since. Gary made the call fast. Frank was lucid but weakening. He could not walk 6 miles through dense alders with a shattered arm. Gary settled Frank against the rock face with clear sight lines, left him both rifles, marked the position, and moved. 6 miles on a logging spur with no pack. Just under 3 hours. He reached the truck, drove the spur back as far as the road allowed, and hiked back in. They had Frank in the truck before early afternoon. He was in surgery the same day. Medical findings and aftermath. The SWAT caused a compound ulna fracture requiring plate and screw fixation. The lacerations needed extensive debridement and 32 sutures. The field pressure dressing had controlled the bleeding adequately. No arterial damage, no tissue death. 4 months of physical therapy. Frank recovered 85% mobility. Cold weather reminds him of the other 15%. Gary was uninjured. Frank replaced the .308 with a .338 Winchester Magnum before the following season. Gary began carrying a satellite communicator on every trip. The margin had been thinner than it should have been. Neither man returned to that drainage. Incident analysis. Track evidence of a dominant apex predator found at mid-morning, with hours of daylight left to relocate. They stayed because moving was inconvenient. That choice compressed every margin they had. The .308 is marginal for stopping a charging grizzly under stress. Shoulder and brisket hits on a bear of that mass are survivable wounds. The attack followed directly from those shots failing to anchor the animal. Gary firing at 6 feet while the bear was on his partner is the sole reason this story doesn't end differently. That was not luck. A pressure dressing on a laceration bleed held over several hours preserves the limb. A tourniquet left for a full day does not. Ischemia sets in well before that point. Gary leaving Frank in a defensible position and moving fast for the truck was correct. Frank could not cover 6 miles. Gary could. Splitting the problem got Frank into surgery the same day.
Practical takeaway. When track evidence puts a dominant grizzly in your immediate area, use your remaining daylight to move. Carry a rifle capable of breaking heavy bone on a charging animal, and train for shot placement under stress. Know the difference between a laceration bleed and an arterial bleed. One needs sustained pressure, the other needs a tourniquet, and getting it wrong costs limbs. Carry satellite communication. Gary ran 6 miles to reach the truck. A communicator makes that run unnecessary. Frank Donnelly had hunted those ridgelines for 20 years. He built the tree stand himself. He knew every trail, every game corridor, every productive edge in that drainage. None of it mattered when the bear decided to climb up and take a look. October 1989. Pine and fir ridgelines in northern Idaho, thick with bear sign by mid-fall. Frank, 43, had finally agreed to bring his nephew Eric, 22, along for the season. Eric had grown up in suburban Denver, visiting Frank's ranch each summer but never hunting serious backcountry. Frank figured a few days in the field would answer the question of what kind of hunter Eric was going to be. The stand was 12 feet up a mature pine, bolted and cable-braced. Solid work. Frank had placed a bait pile 30 yards out and spent the summer patterning bear traffic. Both men were in position before first light on the third morning. Eric's .30-06 resting against the platform rail. The bear appeared at mid-morning, a mature boar, close to 300 pounds.
moving toward the bait pile with the unhurried ease of an animal that had never had a reason to hurry. Eric shifted for a better look. The platform creaked. The bear's head came up. Its eyes moved up the trunk and found both men. It stood on its hind legs and started climbing. Frank's rifle was racked on a branch 6 feet to his left. Unreachable. He reached for it anyway, leaning out across the rail, and when the bear's forepaw caught the near cable support and pulled, the corner of the platform dropped 4 inches, the bolt pulling partially free of the trunk. Frank lost his footing and went over the rail. 12 feet. Left wrist absorbed the impact. The radius snapped at the distal end. Frank rolled onto his back, wind gone, left arm useless. The bear still coming down the trunk. Eric grabbed his rifle and fired once, a poor angle, the round passing through back muscle without hitting spine. The bear reached the ground 6 feet from Frank and turned toward him. Frank had his belt knife out. He could not get to his feet. Eric fired again. The round caught the bear's left shoulder and staggered it sideways. The animal turned, bit into the base of the trunk twice, and charged the tree. The impact shook the platform hard enough that Eric grabbed the rail with both hands, and the rifle went over the side. The bear turned back to Frank. One movement, 6 feet, and it bit down on his right calf. 4 punctures through the muscle. Frank drove the belt knife into the animal's neck with his right hand. The bear released, stepped back 3 paces, and stood there, blood running from the neck wound, looking at both men. Then it walked into the tree line. Eric climbed down. They moved the 2 miles back to the truck together, Frank unable to put full weight on the leg. Medical findings and aftermath. Frank sustained a displaced distal radius fracture requiring surgical plate fixation and 4 puncture wounds to the right calf needing debridement and closure. No arterial or nerve damage. 3 months in a cast, 4 months of physical therapy. A slight permanent loss of dorsiflexion in the left wrist remained. Eric was uninjured. He did not hunt again for 6 years. When he returned, he hunted from the ground. He has not used a tree stand since. Frank reinforced every stand he owned the following spring, reconfigured each platform so his rifle hung within arm's reach, and began carrying a .44 Magnum revolver on his hip whenever he climbed. He still hunts those ridge lines. Incident analysis. 20 years of uneventful tree stand hunts had normalized storing the rifle on a nearby branch. It was habit, not decision. The bear exposed that gap the moment it cleared the platform edge, and Frank had nothing to reach. Eric's first shot was fired from a poor angle under extreme stress and failed to stop the animal. His second shot redirected the bear but cost him the rifle when the platform shook. He had no sidearm, no secondary option, and nowhere to go. Frank's belt knife ended the attack. A fixed-blade knife is not a reliable stopper against a black bear. In this instance, it was enough. That improvised response, made from the ground, broken wrist, bear on top of him, is the reason this story has 2 survivors. Practical takeaway. Your rifle must be within arm's reach in a tree stand, not racked on a branch nearby, not leaning against the rail. Within arm's reach means reachable when the platform is tilting and you are falling. Carry a sidearm on your body as a last resort contact option. It is the one piece of equipment that stays with you, regardless of what happens to everything else. And understand that a bear that can reach your platform height will test it. Build accordingly.
Benjamin Knox heard the snap of the lodgepole branch before he saw the movement. In the soup-thick fog of the Montana high country, sound was the only warning he had. By the time the huffing breath registered, the window for a clean draw had already slammed shut. He never really saw the animal, only a shifting mass of dark fur through the gray veil. By the time he understood what was moving, it was already too late to do anything about the next 4 seconds. Early November 2014. The upper drainages of the Gallatin National Forest in southwestern Montana, dense Douglas fir and lodgepole pine on steep, broken ridgelines. It is the kind of vertical terrain where a man can lose his bearings inside an hour, even in blue sky weather. Benjamin, 36, an experienced bow hunter from Bozeman, was 4 days into a solo elk scout. By mid-morning, he was navigationally blind. He and 2 partners had split at first light, staying in intermittent radio contact. Benjamin was a bow hunter of 15 years. He thrived on close-range discipline. But that morning, a high-altitude fog bank had rolled in, swallowing the ridges and cutting visibility to under 10 feet. His GPS unit had flickered and died, a victim of cold-drained batteries and a failed power port. When he reached for his baseplate compass, he found the housing cracked and the damping fluid gone, the needle dragging uselessly against the plastic. He was alone, injured by a previous fall, and wandering through timber so thick it felt like a cage. He had been side-hilling for 2 hours when the wind shifted. A sudden, violent crash of brush erupted just 10 feet to his left. A deep, rapid huffing sound, the sound of a startled apex predator, tore through the silence. The smell reached him an instant later. Rank musk and the iron scent of old blood. The grizzly hit him laterally before he could even pivot. It was a 400-pound strike across his left shoulder and upper back that drove him face first into the steep slope. His left knee caught a root on the way down, snapping his head forward. His bow was ripped from his grip, skidding out of sight into the underbrush. The bear came down on top of him. Its full weight crushed his lower back into the shale. Benjamin felt 2 ribs give way on the left side, a sharp, sequential crack that stole his breath. He didn't scream. He didn't fight. He buried his face into the pine duff, locked his fingers behind his neck to protect the carotid arteries, and went limp. The bear bit down once. Its canines compressed through his heavy wool jacket and into the muscle of his left shoulder. He heard the sickening pop of his clavicle snapping under the pressure. The pain was a white-hot flash that blurred his vision, but he stayed still. He became a stone. The grizzly stood over him for 30 seconds. He could feel the heat of its breath through his jacket and the vibration of its low, guttural growl in his own chest. Then, the sounds moved away, heavy, receding thuds through the timber. Benjamin waited 10 minutes before he moved. Every breath was a jagged negotiation with his fractured ribs. He rolled over, his left arm hanging uselessly. He found his bow by feel in the dirt, knocked an arrow with his right hand, and began the agonizing descent. The original account claimed he climbed a tree, but with a shattered collarbone and broken ribs, there was no mechanical leverage to pull his weight. Instead, he found a granite overhang that shielded his back. He crawled into an emergency bivy sack, fighting the onset of shock as the temperature plummeted to 28 degrees Fahrenheit. He spent the night listening to the radio static, unable to reach his partners due to the canyon walls. He reached a logging spur late on the second day, driven by adrenaline and the raw instinct to survive.
Medical findings and aftermath.
Imaging confirmed 2 fractured ribs and a non-displaced clavicle fracture. The shoulder bite produced 4 deep puncture wounds, requiring extensive debridement to clear the bacteria. He was hospitalized for 2 days. The ribs healed in 6 weeks. The collarbone took 10. The shoulder still stiffens when the Montana winter sets in, a permanent reminder of the 4 seconds that changed his life. Benjamin rebuilt his kit from the ground up, a dedicated GPS with lithium backups, a compass sealed in a hard-shell case on his belt, and bear spray, always on his hip, never on his pack.
Incident analysis. The navigation failure was the root cause. A dead GPS and a broken compass converted a standard hunt into a survival event. Benjamin's decision to play dead was his only saving grace. The bear's behavior, a single strike and a single bite, indicated a defensive reaction to a surprise encounter in the fog. Had he fought back or tried to run, the bear likely would have finished the kill. The absence of a hard check-in protocol meant no search was initiated until he was already freezing and bleeding in the dark. Practical takeaway. Bear spray belongs on your hip. When you are on the ground with 400 pounds of muscle on your back, your hip is the only thing you can reach. Navigation redundancy is not a suggestion. It is a requirement. Carry a backup compass in a waterproof case separate from your primary gear. Most importantly, establish a search timeline before you leave camp. Those 30 seconds of planning are the difference between being found at noon and being found too late.
Hank Prescott drove out of the Yak River drainage at dawn with his cousin's blood on his jacket. He has spent every year since then examining the decision to stay after that third visit. November 2007. The deep, wet cedar hemlock forests of the Cabinet Mountains in northwestern Montana. Dense canopy, dark undergrowth, accessible only by washed-out logging roads requiring four-wheel drive. Hank, 48, and his cousin Willie Dean, 52, had hunted this backcountry together for over a decade. They ran 2 wall tents, a propane cook station, and a tarp-covered meat cache from 3 productive days in the field. Hank carried an AR-10 in .308. Willie ran a scoped lever-action .35 Remington that his father had left him. In the first 3 days, they had found signs of something working the same ground. Tracks pressed deep into the muddy creek banks, feeding sites torn apart beyond anything familiar. The stride length was wrong for a black bear. The depth suggested mass in a different category entirely. They had started calling it the mule before they knew what it was. The first visit came on the 4th night of their trip. A grizzly in the cooking area, shoulder hump towering, weighing well over 800 pounds. It worked through the cook station methodically while Hank watched. He fired a warning shot over the animal. The bear looked at him and walked into the dark timber at a pace that suggested it had somewhere else to be. The second visit came the following night. It went straight for the meat cache. When Willie fired to drive it off, the bear turned and charged the tent. Both men cleared opposite ends as the canvas collapsed. The bear held at the entrance for nearly a minute before moving back into the dark. The third visit, it came from a different angle. Full weight through the remaining tent wall, propane lines severed, food stores emptied. Hank fired twice into the flank. Willie put a .35 round into the heavy shoulder at 15 feet. The bear stopped, turned toward Willie, and stood there long enough for both men to understand what they were dealing with. Then it walked back into the trees. They debated leaving at first light. Willie said they had enough rifles between them. Hank wasn't sure. They stayed. The final night, the bear came back and did not stop at the camp perimeter. Hank was inside the tarp shelter when Willie shouted once from the direction of the meat cache, 40 feet away. Hank came out with the AR-10 and found the bear on top of Willie in the clearing. He fired 4 rounds into the left flank and neck at under 20 feet. The bear absorbed the hits, turned toward Hank, and held its ground. He fired twice more into the central nervous system. The rear legs went first, then the front, and the massive bear collapsed 6 feet from Willie. Willie was alive. He couldn't speak clearly. Hank packed the deep puncture wounds with clothing, got Willie into the truck bed,
and drove 40 minutes on gutted logging roads to the nearest highway. Willie lost consciousness 8 miles out and did not regain it. Medical findings and aftermath. Willie Dean died from blunt force trauma and internal hemorrhage. The autopsy confirmed bilateral rib fractures, liver laceration, and traumatic pneumothorax. Time from contact to death was estimated at under 90 minutes. Injuries incompatible with survival without immediate surgical intervention in the field, which was not possible. Hank was treated for lacerations to both forearms and released after 2 days. The bear was recovered at the site. A male grizzly officially weighed at 890 pounds. Hank did not return to the Yak Valley. Incident analysis. 3 consecutive nights of escalating contact, confirmed rifle hits, and no lasting deterrence were a complete behavioral pattern. The bear had shown them exactly what it was willing to do and exactly what their firearms were failing to accomplish. They had the truck, the road, and the daylight after the 3rd visit. They chose to stay. The meat cache remained at camp all 4 nights and was the primary attractant. It was the exact location where Willie was killed. Removing it from camp each day would likely have broken the return pattern before the fatal final visit. Warning fire across 3 nights produced no flight conditioning. They continued the same response despite consistent evidence it wasn't working. Hank's 6-round engagement at close range on the final night, targeting the neck and upper spine, produced the incapacitation that earlier shots had not. That decision almost certainly prevented a second fatality. Practical takeaway. When a large apex predator has visited your camp multiple nights in a row and absorbed rifle fire without retreating, it has shown you who it is. That information is complete. Leave before the next night. No camp, no cache, and no hunt is worth what comes after you decide you already know how the 4th night ends.
Ray Matlock read the scene before he followed the drag trail. The fired rifle was on the ground. The bolt cycled but was not rechambered. The blood on the stock. He understood what he was looking at, and he did not go into the timber alone. That decision was the only thing that went right that day. September 1991. The foothills west of Cody, Wyoming were remote enough that Ray, 43, and his hunting partner, Dale Cruz, 47, had scouted 3 days without seeing another person. They had camped near a natural spring where game trails converged from 3 directions. Dale preferred to still hunt the creek corridors on foot each morning, while Ray glassed from elevation above. They carried short-range radios, but had no fixed schedule, only reaching out when someone had an animal on the ground. It was a loose system that had worked for years. That morning, Ray tried to raise Dale on the radio at 10:40. Static. He did not come back. Ray was glassing a natural meadow when 14 deer appeared, feeding calmly in the open grass. Then, every head came up at once. They all turned toward something at the far edge of the meadow, held for several minutes without bolting, and then folded into the aspens at a slow, measured pace. No alarm snorts. They simply left. A smell reached Ray on the upslope draft minutes later. Wet fur, decay, and something underneath, both he didn't have a name for, strong enough to register at his elevation. He tried Dale's radio again. Static. He packed his scope and moved back toward camp. He found the spring first. His own boot prints from the morning were pressed into the soft soil. On top of them, moving in the same direction, was a second set of tracks. Large, stride length wrong for a person, depth suggesting mass well above anything he'd encountered in this country. The tracks led toward camp and did not return.
The campsite was destroyed, both tents down, gear scattered across 30 feet. Dale's .30-06 on the ground near the fire ring. One round fired, bolt cycled but not rechambered. Blood on the rifle stock. A wide drag trail leading northeast into the canyon timber. Ray did not follow it. He shouldered both rifles, walked 4 miles to his truck, and drove to the nearest sheriff's substation. Search and rescue found Dale Cruz the following morning, 380 yards from camp in a dry creek bed. The attack had been brief and overwhelming. Dale had not survived the initial contact. The single-fired round had not produced a disabling wound. There was no evidence he had been able to fire a second time or reach any secondary defense. Medical findings and aftermath. Dale Cruz died at the scene from blunt force trauma and massive soft tissue injury to the torso and neck, consistent with a large bear attack. Forensic assessment indicated the contact progressed faster than Dale could respond effectively after the first shot. Ray sustained no physical injuries and was assessed and released the same day. He gave a full statement to Game and Fish investigators and returned to the site with authorities to assist the search. He described reading the scene, the fired rifle, the drag trail, the destroyed camp, as worse than anything that followed. Game and Fish tracked the Grizzly to a rocky drainage 2 miles northeast. A large boar, estimated at over 600 pounds, was destroyed on site 3 days after the attack. Ray did not hunt alone again. He returned the following year with a partner, strict protocols with a base camp, and bear spray carried on his hip at all times in camp. Incident analysis. Dale was alone at camp when the bear arrived. No fixed check-in protocol meant Ray had no way of knowing contact had been lost until he returned on his own schedule. By the time the radio went silent, it was already over. 1 round from a .30-06 into a 600-pound bear at close range, under sudden contact conditions with no time to place the shot, is not a reliable outcome. Dale had no sidearm, no bear spray within reach. He had one option, and it didn't work. Ray's decision not to follow the drag trail alone was correct. An agitated bear on a fresh kill site is among the most dangerous scenarios in the North American wilderness. Every instinct said, go. He didn't go. That was right. The deer's silent exit, the smell at elevation, the scale of the tracks at the spring. All of it was happening while the attack was unfolding in the valley below. Neither man had a framework for reading those indicators quickly enough to act on them. Practical takeaway. Establish fixed radio check-in intervals when hunting separately, with a defined response timeline if contact is missed. Alone at camp in grizzly country is a vulnerability every time. Not a convenience, not a reasonable split. Bear spray on your hip is the one defense that stays with you, regardless of what position you're in when contact starts. And when the deer leave a meadow without making a sound, pay attention to where they were looking when they left.